Globalno zatopljenje je refren suvremenog doba, mantra koju čujemo sa svih strana i u vezi svih mogućih tema. Od novca, industrije, prehrane, transporta, rasvjete. Temelj ideje jest da čovjek svojom djelatnošću stvara uvjete globalnog zatopljenja, te time postaje neprijatelj životnim sustavima planeta i samome sebi. Da bi ga se u tome spriječilo, uvedeni su i uvode se razni restriktivni zakoni i pravila. No možda vredi vratiti se par koraka unatrag i razmotriti još jednom taj suvremeni mit od samog početka. Više kroz podatke, manje kroz mantre. Dr. Fred Goldberg, školovan na Kraljevskom tehnološkom institutu u Štokholmu u Švedskoj, pokazao se kao informirani sugovornik na temu, neki kažu, fantomskog globalnog zatopljenja, koje se danas na više načina nego što možemo zamisliti doista nalazi na rubu znanosti.
Profesor Fred Goldberg je jedan znanstvenik i stručnjak i praktičar vrlo širokog spektra. Počevši od istraživanja materijala, do obrade materijala poput metala, do različitih izuma, tehnoloških, inženjerskih izuma, do istraživanja klime i njegove, da kažemo, osobne ljubavi Arktik i Antarktik, gdje je sudjelovao u velikim dijelu broju znanstvenih ekspedicija, kontaktirao sa znanstvenicima različitih pogleda i usmjerenja, proučio veliki broj dokumenata i na temelju svega toga stvorio jednu globalnu sliku, a to je ono što nedostaje u sadašnjoj znanosti.
Interes doktora Freda Goldberga za temu globalnog zatopljenja započeo je 2005. godine. I to tamo gdje su konačnici učinci svih globalnih zamisli najviše osjete, u sferi svakodnevnog života.
2005, they implemented a carbon dioxide tax on the electricity bill in Sweden. And I found that very odd because we don't generate electricity in Sweden using coal or oil. We only use nuclear or hydropower. So I found that very illogical. I started digging into this issue and found very suspect things going on, both about why there was a carbon dioxide tax and also about discussions on climate change and so on. At the conference at the Royal Institute, the Swedish representative in the European Union on climate issues gave a speech, and I challenged him with questions, and the answers were very incorrect, and he didn't know that his answer was incorrect. So an interesting situation occurred where the rector for the university was astonished, and he asked me to call him because he wanted to arrange an international climate seminar. So I called up the rector and had a meeting with him together with a professor of chemistry, and I gave him my view on how the climate system is organized. And the director was professor in theoretical physics, so he understood my message, and he agreed to arrange an international seminar and suggested me and the professor of chemistry to organize that and suggest the budget and so on. So we did that, and the rector agreed, and we had a very interesting seminar with 110 people from the whole world, and 12 of the most interesting climate research people from United States, Australia, Europe, lecturing at this conference. So then I got personally acquainted with many experts in astrophysics, oceanography, atmospheric physics and chemistry and so on. So I became very knowledgeable on a shallow level, but on a very broad scientific field, of which many issues coincided with my expertise in welding, where you deal with carbon dioxide, ultraviolet light, ozone, plasma, and things like that, which is also phenomena you deal with in climate. So that is how I got involved and started studying more deeply the different factors affecting the climate and having meetings with experts around the world. And then I got invited to many conferences to give lectures that shook up many people, and I have been invited also to the European Parliament and to the Swedish Parliament and the Norwegian Parliament, and been giving lectures on the climate issue.
U klimatološkim krugovima jedan od poznatih simbola i temelja ideje o globalnom zatopljenju jest slavna statistička krivulja, koju se zbog njenog oblika nazvalo palicom za hokej. Mada često citirana, rasprave u vezi nje nikad nisu prestale. Pitanje jest, nije li slavna krivulja doista iskrivljena?
A hot issue at that time was the IPCC, the International Panel for Climate Change, which is under the umbrella of United Nations. They have been issuing a publication every 5-6 years, and in one of their publications, I don't remember exactly if it was the 2001 or 2007, but I think it was the 2001. It was a curve showing the temperature the last 1,000 years, and the curves show an equal level until 100 years ago, when the temperature curve goes straight up. And this curve is called the hockey stick. And I was disturbed when I saw this stick because it doesn't show the medieval warm period during the Viking Age, and this curve doesn't show the Little Ice Age starting at the second half of the 17th century and forward to the early 20th century. It doesn't show the cooling period. So in my view, it was not a very correct curve. And this curve was heavily debated back and forth by different specialists. But a Canadian person who is not at all an expert on climate, he was an expert on statistics and business investments. He analyzed in detail the background, and he was very clever with computers and programs. And after a lot of trouble getting access to the data behind the hockey stick, he managed to reconstruct it and can demonstrate how they had faked a lot of the data in it, and they duplicated the data and filled in gaps, and they used tree rings that you cannot use for this kind of temperature recording and things like that. And so that got me a flying start, learning all the errors about the hockey stick. And it was Stephen McIntyre and Ross McKittrick, those two, who revealed that this curve was a hoax.
Navodno je za sve kriv ugljični dioksid. Prva mjerenja razine CO2 u atmosferi započela su u 19. stoljeću u Francuskoj. Što se od tada zbivalo?
Measurements of carbon dioxide, to my recollection, started in the mid-1800s in a more systematic manner with chemical methods, wet chemicals. And there are several 100,000 measurements can be found in the archives. And it was only in 1957 that Keeling developed another technology using infrared detector and things like that, which has been used. And that method is a little bit more accurate and easier to use. But it was a Swedish chemist called Svante Arrhenius who, in the early 1900s, realized that with the industrial development, the burning of oil and coal increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And he had discovered that carbon dioxide had a greenhouse effect. And he made some experiments with that. And his experiment showed him that if he doubled the carbon dioxide amount in the atmosphere, it would have a greenhouse effect of 5 centigrades. And that was, of course, alarming facts. But his discussion was forgotten for many years and picked up in the early 1980s, I think. Some people found it advantageous to bring this thing up. And a fellow in Holland, he reproduced Arrhenius' experiments and discovered that if the experiment had been done correctly, the greenhouse effect was 0.22 centigrades. So something went wrong when he got the result 5 centigrades. And probably the reason was that he did not have dry air, he had humid air. And water vapor has a very strong greenhouse effect.
U dugoj povijesti Zemlje razina CO2 nekada se dizala, a nekada padala. Svakako nije riječ o jedinstvenom događaju.
No, correct. I mean, if you go very long time back, if you go 4 billion years back in time, 80% of the Earth's atmosphere was carbon dioxide. So all the rocks we see around us has had its carbon from the atmosphere. And over the years, the carbon dioxide in the air has gone into oceans and then being deposited as limestone in the sea floors. And then over the years on drifting continents, these limestone layers have been thrown up and down, and you find them in the Dolomites, for instance, that is a kind of limestone full of former carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide level has continuously gone down in the atmosphere over these 4 billion years. And today we have a level of 395 parts per million. It is a very, very small fraction left of carbon dioxide, and we are becoming critically near the level where the plants will not survive. The borderline is around 220 parts per million. If we go below that, the plants will not be able to produce their photosynthesis, and all life will disappear. We are getting very close to that level compared to history. We can also go back and have a look at the amount of carbon dioxide about, I think the earliest records I've seen is 12,000 years. And that is because all the plants in their photosynthesis, they suck in carbon dioxide through stomata cells, which they have on the underside of their leaves. And the more carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere, the lesser amount of stomata cells they have. And if it's little carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they have more stomata cells. So by looking at fossil plants that you can find, and sometimes you're lucky, you can find plants that can be dated 10, 12,000 years back, and you study the amount of stomata cells, you can reproduce a curve showing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last years after the Ice Age. And one interesting observation is that if we have a warmer climate, we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if we have a colder climate, like during the Little Ice Age, we have less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
Drugim riječima, odnos uzroka i posljedice je upravo obrnut od onog kako se danas predstavlja. Povećanje CO2 je posljedica toplih klimatskog razdoblja, a nije toplih klimatsko razdoblje posljedica povećanja CO2 u atmosferi.
And the reason for that is simple. The ocean's solubility for carbon dioxide is depending on the water temperature. So if we have cold water, it will absorb more carbon dioxide. And if we have warm water, the carbon dioxide goes up in the atmosphere. And we can take an example like a bottle of mineral water with gas. When they produce this bottle of mineral water, the water temperature is usually around 5 centigrades. and the brewery will only let the carbon dioxide bubble through the water, and the water is absorbed. The carbon dioxide is absorbed in the water instantly. You have maybe seen the small machines you can buy called soda stream, where you can make your own mineral water. So you can see that in a few seconds the carbon dioxide is absorbed in the cold water. So this reproduces actually what is happening in the oceans. And in the Earth's circulation system, the sun is heating the oceans over the equator plus minus 18 degrees. And here the water is evaporating from the sun heating and releasing carbon dioxide, but it also releases, because of the warming of the water, the carbon dioxide is relieved. And then this carbon dioxide is blown with the trade winds north and south, and when it comes in contact with the colder water in the North Atlantic, Northern Pacific, around Antarctica, the carbon dioxide is absorbed into the ocean. So there's a continuous cycle of carbon dioxide going this way. And we talk about 90 gigatons of coal being circulated per year, which is quite a bit.
Posljednjih godina u Europi su bile jake zime i mada je uzorak možda premalen za globalne zaključke, svakako nije bio u duhu ideje o globalnom zatopljenju. O tome se mnogo pisalo, pa su zagovornici teorije globalnog zagrijavanja rekli da je to zahlađenje posljedica globalnog zatopljenja. Da se tope ledenjaci, pa da dolazi sve više hladne vode i sve više vlage, koja donosi više kiše i snijega i tako dalje. No, dr. Fred Goldberg sa svojih arktičkih putovanja donio je vlastita zapažanja.
My experience is that most people discussing these issues have not understood what's going on, and especially not meteorologists. The real reasons is not included in their education, and we have a 60-year cycle in the Pacific Ocean. It's a current called Pacific Decadal Oscillations, or PDO. Which has a 60-year cycle, meaning that 30 years the circulation of the Pacific Ocean on the northern half, primarily above the equator, goes in a clockwise direction, being negative, and it goes in an anti-clockwise direction, being positive. And the reason that the ice is melting in the Arctic is not because of any warmer climate, because the warm air does not melt very much ice. It is warm water melting ice. So what's been happening is that from 1977 until 2008, warm water has been flowing into the Arctic Ocean through Bering Strait because the PDO has been positive. And that has slowly reduced the ice. And this time period from 77 coincides very well with the time period of satellite observations showing the ice being reduced. So it is a coincidence that the start of the satellite observations in 1979 is close to the moment when PDO reversed, starting the melting of the ice. But now PDO reversed in 2008 in April, and 1 year later the whole Arctic Ocean had 1 meter thicker ice than in 2007. And it has been continuing to grow except this last winter when we had an El Nino in the Pacific that changed the conditions, reducing the amount of ice. But also in 2007, when it was very little ice extent, they say. It's important to know that when they look at the ice from satellite, they see the ice extent and the open water, but they don't see the thickness of ice. So 2007, it was much more ice in the Arctic than they claim, because the ice was with strong winds and currents pushed against Canada and Greenland, creating more open water than before. But the ice was twice as thick as normal where it was. And this was verified by a Swedish big icebreaker that was operating north of Greenland and had extreme difficulties getting through the ice. The Swedish icebreaker Oden had been to the North Pole 4 or 5 times, never had any big problems going to the North Pole, but going through the ice north of Greenland in 2007 was critical. And that year I was on Svalbard, and I was standing at the dock when the icebreaker came in, and I took some films of the icebreaker with glaciers in the background, and I came on board. The captain is a friend of mine, so I made an interview with my video camera where he explained about the problems with the thick ice. And then when I came home the next day, I gave the material to Swedish national television, and they took my material and showed the nice photos of the icebreaker and the glaciers, but they didn't show the interview where the captain explained the ice difficulties, because they have only been talking about the disappearing ice in the Arctic. They didn't want to give the wrong impression to the people that there is a lot of ice in the Arctic, which it actually was. So there's a lot of misinformation on these ice issues in the Arctic, unfortunately. And the purpose is to scare people that we are changing the climate, causing the ice to melt, which is not correct.
I sam pojam klimatskih promjena, to je kovanica koja silom prilika i podataka postupno zamjenjuje pojam globalnog zatopljenja, nije nešto što ekskluzivno pripada današnjem dobu. Je li djelovanje ljudi doista uzrok klimatskim promjenama?
That's just, I mean, if you claim something like that, you get more money from the politicians for your research, but it has nothing with the truth to do. And for instance, in the Antarctic, they, at a Russian base called Vostok, which means eastern, they drilled an ice core to the bottom, and they drilled through 600,000 years of ice. And with the isotope oxygen 18, you can see what the temperature was when the snow fell in the Antarctic. And you can see the ice ages and the interglacial periods and the temperatures. And it is then interesting to note that during the 3 previous interglacial periods, going back 400,000 years, it was warmer, a few centigrades warmer globally than today. So nothing that has happened today is something different from what has been before. And when I asked the experts why was it warmer during the previous interglacial period than today, I never get an answer. They don't know. We don't know enough what the reason is. The only thing we can say is that it has to do with the sun and what's happening out in space. And I have some theories of my own that could explain what's going on, but I haven't published it yet. And then it is also important to mention that there has been a climate change. Nobody I know is denying that, even if we are blamed for denying that. I don't know anybody denying that there's climate change. The important issue is that it's not humans creating the climate change. It is all natural. And why is it all natural? Well, let's look at the basics about carbon dioxide. We know a lot about the chemical properties of carbon dioxide. And if we look into the basic facts and don't ignore them, we can see that carbon dioxide only absorbs a very narrow frequency of infrared. It's 4.2 microns and 14 to 16 microns, 2 very narrow bands. But water vapor absorbs very wide bands across the spectra. And when you look at that, you can easily see, well, also it's important to mention that water vapor is 30,000 parts per million average in the atmosphere, 30,000, and carbon dioxide is 395. So it's almost 100 times more water vapor in the atmosphere. And when you take that into account and look at the absorption, it's easy to understand that the greenhouse effect of carbon dioxide is only 1% of the total. And the water vapor greenhouse effect is 95% of the total, which means that the human emissions of carbon dioxide has no measurable effect. We should also take into account that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere caused by humans from fossil burning is only 4% of the total amount in the atmosphere, which means that the human effect on the climate is 4% of 1%, which is such a small number that it can't be measured. Then there are two other factors that are important to take in account. And one is the saturation effect. If we would double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from today's level, which is not physically possible, we don't have enough coal and oil to do that. And if we did it, most of it would go into the oceans anyway. But even if we managed, the increase of temperature due to the greenhouse effect would be maybe 0.1 or 0.2 centigrades, because we have reached near the maximum saturation level of carbon dioxide. The greenhouse effect is not linear with the amount of gas. It is a logarithmical curve, which is now tapering off quickly. So most of the greenhouse capacity of carbon dioxide has already been used. And that is always ignored by the scientists behind IPCC, for instance. And the other factor that is never mentioned, and I couldn't even find a diagram, I had to make one myself, is the solubility of carbon dioxide in water, and that it is depending on the water temperature. So if we have 5 centigrade water temperature, we can dissolve, in pure water, we can dissolve 3 grams of carbon dioxide. And if the water temperature is 25 centigrades, we can only dissolve 1.5 gram or half as much carbon dioxide. So that the oceans are pumping huge amounts of carbon dioxide in and out because of seasonal temperature changes. But also what has happened is that during the last 100 years, due to increased solar activity, the ocean temperature have gone up about 1 centigrade. And that increased temperature has caused the carbon dioxide in the oceans to go out in the atmosphere, increasing the carbon dioxide level from 290 100 years ago to 395 today. And it's not because of human emissions, it's because of increased ocean temperature.
Mada se to ne čuje često u medijima, ali danas mnogi astronomi ukazuju na vezu aktivnosti Sunca i smjene toplih i hladnih razdoblja na Zemlji. Primjerice, sunčevih pjega u 17. stoljeću nestalo, a na Zemlji je zavladalo takozvano malo ledeno doba. I zapravo je pomalo nevjerojatno koliko se Sunce rijetko spominje u kontekstu klimatskih oscilacija.
The sun is, of course, controlling our climate. To believe anything else is a big mistake. It's all based on the sun, but not sun alone. The sun has sunspots, and the number of sunspots is important because it tells us about the solar activity. And when we have a high solar activity, we have a lot of sunspots, which means that we also have a strong solar wind, which is electromagnetic particle flow against Earth. And when the sun is very active, it increases the strength of the magnetosphere around Earth. And when we have a strong magnetosphere, the cosmic radiation from exploding stars in outer space, when it comes near Earth, it is repelled back again because the magnetic sphere is shielding Earth from the radiation, which means that we have less clouds. If the sun is inactive, the cosmic radiation is coming into our atmosphere, increasing the amount of clouds. And the clouds are shading the incoming sunlight, and it will cool the Earth. And this is a very important regulator controlling our climate within certain limits. That if it gets too warm, we have more humidity, more clouds, which will cause cooling, and then we have less humidity, and it goes back and forth with the sun as a controlling mechanism. And so what is very important is how much clouds do we have in our atmosphere. And if the cloud content is increased by 1%, it will be a cooling of 1 centigrade globally. And the opposite, if you have less clouds, you have a warming of 1 degree centigrade. That means that if we increase the clouds 4%, we will go into an ice age, because we only need a reduced 4 degrees temperature globally. We will be in an ice age. So that is a very important mechanism that is controlling everything. So the astrophysics people studying the sun and its cycles, they have now seen that the many different cycles, when added together, they show a very low intensity in the sun. So we are now heading into the same sun activity level that we had in the second half of the 1600s, which is when we had the Little Ice Age. And we will be heading into cold times the next 25, 30 years for 2 reasons. One is this sun activity is going into a low phase, and the second reason is that the ocean current, PDO, in the Pacific is negative, not sending warm water into the Arctic anymore. So the ice will increase in the Arctic, and it also has a cooling effect on the Northern Hemisphere for the next 30 years. So that combination is not a very good one. And it is also that combination that I used when I predicted 3 years ago. I predicted that we would have a cold war winter, we call it. Like during the Second World War, 1940-41, it was a very cold winter. I said 3 years ago at a big conference that we will have such a winter, and people just laughed and thought I was crazy, because it's not possible to determine that ahead of time, according to the meteorological experts. But to their surprise, they found I was right. So they asked me, well, what is next winter going to be like? So I told them, well, I'm sorry to tell you, it will be even colder. And then they rushed home and started chopping wood and getting prepared. And I was right again, it was colder. But this last winter, I couldn't give a definite answer, because we had an El Nino effect changing the conditions. So we had a fairly mild winter, this last one, at least in Northern Europe. But other places around the world had a pretty cold winter, the last one, because of the general conditions with low solar activity and so on. And the coming winter will be not too cold, because we have a solar sunspot maximum next year. But it will be at a much lower level than the previous maximum 11 years ago. And then it will be going downhill with the conditions. And it will result in famine. It will be poor food production around the world because of the cooling, of course. And our politicians, they should prepare for these conditions and fill up the silos with cereals and prepare for bad years that it will be coming, instead of chasing carbon dioxide, which actually improves the food production. The more carbon dioxide we have in the atmosphere, the better all the plants grow. The plants would like 3 times more carbon dioxide than we actually have in the atmosphere. So the politicians are spending tremendous amount of money doing the absolutely wrong things.
Zanimljivo je uočiti činjenicu da se porast globalne temperature Zemlje u nekim desetljećima zbivao istovremeno s povećanjem emitiranja CO2, a u nekim drugim desetljećima emitiranje CO2 se povećavalo dok se temperatura smanjivala. U konačnici možemo se zapitati i koliko pouzdano uopće možemo izmjeriti prosječne globalne temperature.
Global temperature curves goes up and down. If we start at 1980, it goes down to 1910, and then it goes up to 1940. It's a fairly rapid warming, and that is the PDO effect. The PDO reversed in 1910, it reversed in 1940, and then it became colder. And between 1940 and 77, we had a colder period, and the climate experts, they said that we were heading for a new ice age, and they wrote books about we had to prepare for an ice age, and there were big articles in Time magazine about the coming ice age and so on. But the ice age didn't come because 1977 PDO reversed to positive, and we got into a new warming period. And then the same scientists said that we're having global warming, and it will be dramatic and catastrophic and so on. So there are many ways of earning money as a scientist. But then the temperature increased to 2008 when PDO reversed again. But the solar intensity maximum peaked at 2002. So since 2002, there hasn't been any global warming. It's been slowly going down. And when I asked the experts how it's possible that we have not had any global warming since 2002, but we humans have released something like 450 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which has a strong warming effect, according to specialists, how is that possible? Then I don't get any answers, because the answer is very inconvenient to these people. But also what is important to point out is that the temperature curve from the 80s and 90s is going quite sharp up. And that curve is not correct. There are three different errors in that global temperature curve. One is that the number of stations used for calculating the global warming changed dramatically. In 1970s, there were 15,000 stations, and then around 1988 to 90, it dropped dramatically to 6,000, and today it's 1,500. And what happened 88, 90? Well, the Soviet Union collapsed, and most meteorological stations in Siberia, in the cold areas, were closed down. So the balance between cold and warm stations around the world changed dramatically. So the average temperature then suddenly shot up in the air. And that is one part of the error. Another error is the urban effect. These meteorological stations are usually placed near big cities, or even in the middle of big cities that have been growing rapidly. And there has not been any corrections for the urban effect, because it's very, very difficult to calculate the urban effect, because the urban effect is different with the seasons, the day of time, day or night, with the wind direction and wind speed. The urban effect would change all the time, so it's very difficult to really know what the urban effect is. But one example is that I live 10 kilometers from downtown Stockholm, and in my car I have a thermometer telling me the temperature outside. So when I start from my home, I can read that I have 2 centigrades like I had this morning. But then when I come downtown Stockholm, it shows 4 centigrades. So there's a 2-degree temperature difference, which is the urban effect, only within 10 kilometers of downtown Stockholm. And then there are other factors also. For instance, 90% of the thermometer stations are based on land, but land is only 30% of Earth's surface. So there is a major error in trying to measure the global temperature. So the only proper way to get a decent, good figure is using satellites. That is scanning the whole surface of the Earth all the time and calculating the temperature. But we only have data that goes back to 1979 for those measurements. So the steep increase in curve in the 80s and 90s are to a large extent caused by these measurement errors. And in my lecture, I show pictures of stations incorrectly positioned. For instance, 54% of all stations used for global calculations are airports. And airport is not a very good place to get an objective number because the tarmac is being heated much more than a normal place, and you have all the exhaust from the airplanes heating up, and sometimes the thermometers are standing just behind the jet engines, blowing straight at them. I have seen examples of that. So it is not as easy as you think to measure a temperature.
Što se može naslutiti o političkoj, a možda i financijskoj pozadini politike koja promiče nešto tako neuhvatljivo i nevidljivo kao što je globalno zatopljenje?
I can write a thick book on that subject. It's interesting, makes life exciting, that's for sure. But to go back in history a little bit, we had a prime minister in Sweden called Olof Palme that was assassinated in 1986, as you might remember. And he was interviewed by a journalist in 1976, and he was asked, what does the world look like 25 years from now? And Palme gave several interesting, good answers, but he also said that the biggest threat against the world the year 2000 will be global warming. And it's quite astonishing that he said that, because there wasn't any global warming. Nobody had heard about global warming in 1976, because it didn't really start until 1977, when PDO reversed. Then the temperature started to increase. Up to 77, everybody talked about temperatures going down and we are heading for an ice age. And then Palme goes out with the opposite. And why did he do that? Well, the reason is that his tennis partner was Bert Bolin, a professor of meteorology, who was also the founder of IPCC. And the reason was that Palme was desperately trying to find another source for tax. He needed more money for his business, and it was not possible to increase the current taxes we already had, because Sweden was already the highest taxed country in the world, which we suffered from, everybody. So Bolin suggested that he should put a tax on carbon dioxide. And doing that, you can also control people's movements, and you have world governance if you do that. So Palme thought that was a good idea. So he started promoting this and spreading the word that humans are destroying the world by emitting carbon dioxide. We must cut down the emissions, we must charge tax, etc. And then, of course, there are always winners and losers. The losers are the man on the streets, the common man paying this carbon tax, but there are also winners who are dealing with trading carbon, carbon, you buy carbon outlets. So the financial people, they love this because they cut a few percent on these deals. And in the US, for instance, I think they said that if they implemented the carbon trading, it would have a turnover of $600 billion. And the financial people cut 2%, so they can pocket $12 billion if it was implemented. But the opposition in the US, they want to have a carbon tax instead, which means the financial people won't collect any money. So that's the kind of fight they have there. And but also the US have spent, in the last 10 years, I believe they have spent something like $100 billion on climate research. It's a terribly lot of money, but There are also winners collecting this money. And many of them are scientists. And they are prepared, many of them, to say anything to get the politicians to keep spending money. And a lot of this research is very good, valuable research. For instance, the Argos buoys that they have set out in the Pacific Ocean, they have 3,500 buoys that once a month they stay 700 meters depth, and once a month they go up to the surface and measure temperature. And then they transmit the results, and then they go back down 700 meters, and then keep going up and down every month. 3,500 systems like that. They cost a lot of money. But that collects information about the total energy content of the oceans. And the results show that the surface temperature is slowly going down in the last 10 years. And the energy content is staying, has tapered off. It increased before. Now it's horizontal and starting to go down again also, showing that we are going into a serious cooling period. But the politicians, they love this issue, and they are prepared to do anything to take your money for carbon dioxide. And one typical example was, not too long ago, I met the Swedish Minister of Environment, Lena Ek, and I said to her that Sweden is emitting a total of 50 million tons of carbon dioxide with all our transports and house warming and so on. But the humans living on Earth are breathing out 3,500 million tons of carbon dioxide. So I asked her if she thinks that if we reduce our emissions by 10, 20 or 30% at a very high cost, if that would change the climate. And her answer was, yes, absolutely. Which proves that she's either extremely stupid or very dishonest. There are only those two categories left. And it is tragic that the politicians are not following basic facts of science. They are lying to the public on these issues in order to take our money. It's a very sad situation.
U kojoj mjeri i na koji način se danas znanstvena zajednica podijelila oko pitanja ima li ili nema globalnog zatopljenja?
There are many more professors converting from alarmism, as we call it, to skepticism because they're looking at the facts and they change their mind. But remember one important thing. When they change their mind, they have retired. They don't any longer depend on the politicians to pay their salary. They are retired. Then they dare to tell the truth. So most of these people who are in their career, they don't dare to tell the truth because they will lose funding or lose their jobs even. Also journalists, if they are honest and write an honest article, there are many journalists who have lost their jobs because they did that. And a friend of mine in Finland, he is a professor in Turku. His colleague is a professor of chemistry. He had a very big, important chemical project, and he asked for $1 million funding to continue the project, and he was denied this, so he was desperate. What shall I do? So my friend asked him, well, did you include anything about the climate in your application? No, this has nothing to do with the climate, he said. Well, that's your problem. You have to include the climate. So he helped him write a new application for funding where they put in the word climate in a few places and so on and exaggerated the effect. And then he got the funding he wanted. So it's not bad that if you lie, you get your money. And there are very few people that are brave enough to tell the truth if they are not retired on this issue. And also a very interesting man, he's a solar physicist, that is a friend of mine. He explained also that he tells his students not to get involved in the area of climate because then they cannot be honest anymore. So he directs his students into other areas so they don't have to get involved in this circus, so to say. For instance, the European Union, they spend a lot of money on the climate issue. And what do? Well, it is bureaucrats in Brussels who have not been democratically elected that have leftist sympathies where this climate alarmism comes from. It comes from the left. And they are giving hundreds of millions of euros to NGOs. So they let them do the propaganda on the climate issues and saying that the polar bears are threatened, which they are not. There have never been more polar bears in the Arctic than there is right now. When I was up there last summer, I saw 15 polar bears in one day. When I was up there 1966, I saw 4 polar bears in 2 months. So you can compare the numbers. And it is a very sad situation. And this, of course, creates a lot of animosity against the European Union because the bureaucrats are taking a lot of decisions. I mean, the bureaucrats decided that no cars can emit more than 119 grams of carbon dioxide. Well, every car fabricated in Sweden emits a lot more than that because we are specialized in making bigger cars in Sweden because we cannot compete with small cars in Sweden. So the Swedish car industry is disappearing. Saab is gone and the Chinese took over what was left of Volvo. And who knows how long Volvo will exist, not in Sweden at least. So people are now becoming quite a bit against the European Union because of reasons like that. And in my opinion, the European Union is a very good idea, but it's being misused in many ways. And I like the idea of free travel over the borders, you can work anywhere inside the European Union. You don't have to worry about the customs and things. I remember the old days when I traveled across Europe to set up an exhibit at a trade show, and you had to spend hours crossing the border, stamping papers, and it was quite expensive too. And now you just go straight through. You don't even see the customs people. So there's a lot of advantages, but there are also, unfortunately, some big disadvantages causing problems. And the climate issue is one costing a lot of money, increasing the financial problems we have today. The climate issues have certainly contributed quite a bit here.